I got permission from the Quarto Group to read this. This is a shocking story. It could never take place in most American towns, but it did in this one. It is a public challenge not to let it happen again. In case you don't know who I am, my name is Dawn and I work here at FX Caprara Harley-Davidson. Alright guys, so I'm going to start reading you portions of the Harley-Davidson Reader. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all of it, just portions of it. Of course, if you do want to read all of it, you can grab one of these books for your very own. All right, let's get started, shall we? I have a dog here in my mouth. All right, guys, so we're going to get started. And I got permission from the Quarto Group to read this. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. They wanted me to mention that up front. And the pictures that you're going to be seeing, the archival footage, that's straight from Harley-Davidson. So all is good. And the first part that I'm going to read is about a little town that isn't too far from where I grew up. Long before millennials knew it as a clothing company, I knew it for other reasons. And we are looking at The Shocking Story, The Wild One and the Ones That Weren't So Wild by Michael Dregni. And again, I apologize if I mispronounce that. The Wild One was loosely based on events that purportedly took place during a 4th of July celebration by motorcyclists in the sleepy little town of Hollister, California in 1947. But the truth behind the tales has long been debated. Photographs were fixed, news reports bloated, events distorted. In this essay, Michael Dregni looks at the various versions of one of the formative events in creating motorcycling's outlaw mystique. It was a movie with a reputation, as folk used to say. I remember the first time I saw it, almost 4 decades after it was first released. It was showing at a revival theater that screened an oddball assortment of classics and forgotten movies from days past. The theater was as old as many of the movies themselves, and indeed had shown some of them when they first opened. The red velvet that had covered the chairs was threadbare. The seats squeaked when you sat down, and the air had a smell of popcorn from decades ago. Then the lights dimmed, and the surroundings were forgotten. Onto the screen, in glorious black and white, burst the opening images of a country road and the sound of motorcycles in the distance. In a flash, the title rolled across the screen, The Wild One. Although decades had passed since its debut, there was still an aura to this famous, or more likely infamous, film. It was dangerous, subversive. It even began with a warning that echoed the first lines of Dante's guided tour of hell. This is a shocking story. It could never take place in most American towns, but it did in this one. It is a public challenge not to let it happen again. It was a day that would live in infamy. Pearl Harbor was history, and World War II was finally finished. But in the days after the war, some young men returning from battle had a craving for something different from the ordered life and the American dream that they had fought for. Kickstarting a motorcycle into life and riding it off to find the horizon filled the bill. It was just such a ride that brought a group of motorcyclists searching for fun to a sleepy little town of Hollister, California on the 4th of July in 1947. What really happened at Hollister is impossible to tell from today's vantage. There are many versions of the story of the day that changed from motorcycling forever, and none of them are consistent with the other. There's one thing that they all agree on, however. The story as presented in Life magazine and Marlon Brando's movie, The Wild One, was a hoax. It all began with a photograph. Late editions of the San Francisco Chronicle on July 5th, 1947, carried the first version of the story. A gang of drunken motorcyclists called the Booze Fighters had invaded the town of Hollister on America's most sacrosanct day, July 4th. They had raced through the streets on their motorized steeds, terrifying good people. They drank beer and brawled and distressed young damsels. Life in Hollister would never be the same. A single photograph was sent out over the wires to news media around the country. In the photograph, taken by Barney Peterson, a fat slob of a motorcyclist sat astride his Harley, surrounded by a sea of empty bottles. He clutched a couple of beers in his evil claws and leered at the camera. In his eyes was a cold message: bar your doors and lock away your daughters because I'm coming to get ya. A photo editor at Life saw the photograph and marked it for use. At the time, Life held the respect of Americans like no magazine before or since. Life had told the awful story of World War II in words and photographs. It was not until Walter Cronkite arrived in American living rooms every evening on the television that the news media had a more powerful single voice. Life reported, on the 4th of July weekend, 4,000 members of a motorcycle club roared into Hollister, California for a 3-day convention. They quickly tired of ordinary motorcycle thrills and turned to more exciting stunts. Racing their vehicles down the main streets and through the traffic lights, they rammed into restaurants and bars, breaking furniture and mirrors. Police arrested many, but could not restore order. When Life ran the photo with the story of the Hollister brouhaha, the awful event was catapulted into the hearts and minds of Americans everywhere. The story of Hollister had all the makings of myth. Almost overnight, a new menace was at hand, and every motorcyclist was suddenly seen as one of the dreaded booze fighters. Then came the movie. In 1953, The Wild One, starring Marlon Brando, opened at a theater near you. In the film, Marlon Brando played the leader of the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club, a cool cat named Johnny Strabler, who wore the black leather jacket like a suit of armor against the world. Atop his Triumph Thunderbird, he led his gang on the 4th of July ride up the California coast, stopping to wreak havoc at a motorcycle race before moving on to terrorize an innocent small town based on Hollister. When the gang arrives in town, it makes a beeline for Bleeker's Cafe and Bar. Members drop their change into the jukebox and order up rounds of beer. One townsgirl, taken by the excitement, follows the gang and says, "Black Rebels Motorcycle Club. That's cute." "Hey, Johnny, what are you rebelling against?" With studied nonchalance, Johnny answered, "What do you got?" "Kathy." "What do you do? I mean, do you just ride around? Or do you go on some sort of picnic or something?" "Johnny." "A picnic? Man, you are too square. I have to straighten you out. Now listen, you don't go to any one special place. That's cornball style. You just go. A bunch gets together. After a week, it builds up. The idea is to have a ball. Now, if you're going to stay cool, you got to wail. You got to put something down. You got to make some jive. Don't you know what I'm talking about?" Obviously, she doesn't have a clue. Soon, Johnny will take Kathy for a ride on his Triumph, giving society a taste of freedom on 2 wheels. "I've never ridden a motorcycle before," Kathy exclaims with delight. "It's fast. It scared me. But I forgot everything. It felt good." Then, the true bad guy shows his face. Lee Marvin and his gang of bad guys ride into town. As Kathy walks home from work, Marvin on his Harley-Davidson leads his gang to encircle the woman, spinning around in a kaleidoscope of revving bikes, moving in for the kill, just like the Indians circling the wagon train in a Wild West shoot-'em-up. Only Johnny can save her, whisking her away on his Triumph like a knight in shining armor. Brando's character was confusing to 1950 audiences. He was the bad guy and the good guy. Everyone knew full well that the bad guys wore black hats and the good guys wore white. Now suddenly here was Johnny wearing a black leather jacket and a black cap, terrorizing the town with his good-for-nothing bikers, and then midway through the movie, another side of his character gradually comes to light. Johnny ain't all bad, just confused. Under the mask of that emotionless face and the armor of his jacket, he's introspective, questioning. Johnny was the first anti-hero role in Hollywood. The movie was not a hit when it made its debut. Many theater owners refused to screen such trash. It was only 79 minutes long, short by modern standards. The film struck a chord with a certain disaffected crowd that were tantalized by the rebellion and by Brando's character. He was romanticized Robin Hood on a cycle, offering would-be rebels an image to live by. Sales of black leather jackets soared. Brando related in his autobiography and suddenly became a symbol, although what the symbol stood for was truly not understood. Brando writes that he never expected the Wild One to have such an impact. Quote, "I was surprised as anyone when t-shirts, jeans, and leather jackets suddenly became symbols of rebellion. After the Wild One was finished, I couldn't look at it for weeks. When I did, I didn't like it because I thought it was too violent." End quote. John Cameron was there at Hollister on the 4th of July in 1947. He remembers the events that created the myth and calls it all a hoax. Cameron spent the best years of his life aboard a motorcycle. In a 1995 videotaped interview with motorcycle historian Paul Johnson, he read his resume. "I've been riding motorcycles since 1928. I've had pretty near Harleys all my life, except for one Crocker, which is the only bike I ever bought new, and I still have it." The booze fighters were not exactly a knitting circle, but on the other hand, they weren't overgrown Boy Scouts that had turned world-class delinquents either. In Cameron's mind, they were a bunch of good old boys who liked beer and bikes, just like members of every of the other motorcycle clubs starting up around the same time in California. Most of them were former servicemen who were drawing $20 a week for the first year out of service, the so-called 5220 benefit. And they were eager to taste some of that freedom they had been fighting for. But as another booze fighter said, we never tried to hurt anybody because we'd all been hurt in the war. One day, just after World War II had ended, Wino Willie Faulkner, Cameron, and some other buddies were spectating at a Class C race in El Cajon, California. We were out in the parking lot, and that crazy Willie said, "Let's put on a show." Well, that show landed him in jail. When Willie was set loose again in 90 days, that's when the booze fighters got kickstarted. "Willie belonged to a club called 13 Rebels," said Cameron. "He just went to a club meeting after he got out of jail, and they jumped all over him about what he'd done, so he ripped his sweater off and quit." Cameron and his bunch were having beer at their chosen corner of heaven, the All-American Bar in South Los Angeles, where the rebellious Willie walked in, stripped of his 13 Rebels colors. "We were sitting there drinking a little," remembered Cameron, "and Willie said we should start our own club. Someone retorted, 'Yeah, but what will we call it?' Another well-oiled motorcyclist named Walt Porter drawled out, 'Call it the Booze Fighters. That's what they're mad about. You're boozing and fighting.' It had a certain ring to it, so Booze Fighters it was." Alongside Wino Willie, Cameron, and the veteran drinker, the Booze Fighters were primarily made up of racers. Their uniform was a white sweater with green sleeves, a far cry from Brando's black leather jacket. On the 1947 4th of July weekend in question, the Booze Fighters made up their minds to hit the road. With visions dancing in their heads of motorcycle races followed by cold beer, they rode north out of San Diego, bedrolls strapped to the back of their bikes. Hollister appeared before them like an oasis on a never-ending road, so they turned into town and made a beeline for the local watering hole. "All that mess never happened," Cameron said, shaking his head at memories of the live photograph and the Wild One. On the other hand, just as Marlon Brando would say in the movie, it wasn't exactly a picnic outing either. Reports differed dramatically about the number of bikers that descended on Hollister and the subsequent goings-on. Some say there were upwards of 4,000 motorcyclists swarming through the town. The war was over, and Life magazine didn't have anything exciting, Cameron recounts, and so they imported those people. It was an actor. He looked like a booze fighter named Fat Boy Nelson, but it wasn't him because Fat Boy was riding a Crocker at the same time, and the guy in the photo was on a Harley. Still, that pictured Harley had the words Booze Fighters MC painted across the tank. No one was going to sit on their bike on the sidewalk and drink that many beers. The cops would run you off. Cameron shook his head with the voice of experience. You could do a one-time thing like ride into a bar and then ride out again. Whatever the truth was, the photo spoke louder than the words of a handful of booze fighters. Cameron acknowledged the effect it had with a sorrowful shake of his head. That photograph changed the image of motorcycling forever. It was one of the most important things that happened to motorcycle in all eternity. Watching the wild one these days is like climbing aboard a 1912 Harley-Davidson Silent Gray Fellow and riding off down modern-day streets. You wonder what all the fuss was about. Movies such as The Wild Angels, The Leather Boys, Easy Rider, and many other biker classics today have a period charm. They're timepieces, practically Victorian drawing room dramas. Hell, they're almost cute. That's missing the point, however. Watching the wild one in a revival theater from today's vantage point, it's impossible to see the movie and its message from the point of view of the audiences in 1953. Yet the images of fear and loathing that the wild one once inspired toward motorcyclists and their innocent machines were real. After the film opened, you had to be a brave soul to wear a black leather jacket into your local small-town cafe. Many folk believed that the switchblade was the chief tool you needed to ride a cycle. It wasn't for naught that when Honda motorcycles were launched in the United States in the early 1960s, the importer spent big bucks on its ad campaign, "You meet the nicest people on Honda." The motorcyclist's image needed a haircut, shave, and a new set of respectable clothes. Today, the town of Hollister holds an annual Independence Day motorcycle race and rally that trades on the commercial value of the 1947 fracas that once seemed as threatening the end of the free world as we know it. Black leather motorcycle jackets are as common as boxer shorts, and if you're a stockbroker or a dentist that doesn't own a Harley, then you stand out from the crowd. The Wild One, once the scourge of movie theaters, is a popular video rental. I even have a copy. The motorcycle has come full circle in acceptance. The outlaw biker mystique that once shocked and terrified the masses has been subjugated into the mainstream, eaten up by society, and spit out as everyday fashion. So, hope you enjoyed that little blip from the Harley-Davidson Reader. If you like it, be sure and give me a thumbs up. And if you want to see more, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thank you very much for watching. Until the next time, stay safe and have fun, everybody.